I am Dominique, 35 years old, and at Thanksgiving dinner, my mother called my 6-year-old daughter an ugly black girl. She actually slapped my little girl across the table over a toy and screamed that she was an ungrateful kid. Just days later, my parents showed up at my front door with fake tears and desperate smiles after seeing what my daughter had done that had the entire country talking. Before I share how I brought my toxic family to their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace from the people who were supposed to love you most. Growing up in Oak Park, Illinois, meant living in a world completely defined by appearances. My mother Brenda and my father Calvin cared about exactly two things: wealth and proximity to whiteness. Our house was a sprawling brick estate filled with expensive art-imported furniture and suffocating expectations. My older sister Chantel was the undeniable golden child of the family. She had lighter skin, looser curls, and eventually she brought home the ultimate prize in my parents' eyes, a white husband named Trent. To my parents, Chantel was the perfect daughter who did everything right. I was the dark-skinned daughter they merely tolerated, the one who never quite fit into their carefully curated bourgeois narrative. Now at 35, I am the founder and chief executive officer of a premier diverse talent and media agency. I represent some of the most influential voices in the country. But to my family, I was just a struggling single mother who needed to be pitied. They had absolutely no idea that I was quietly building a multi-million-dollar empire. They never asked about my work, and I never offered the information. It was easier to let them believe their own assumptions while I secured my future and the future of my daughter Zuri. Thanksgiving dinner was always a grand production at my parents' house. The dining room table was set with fine china crystal glasses and an enormous turkey that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. My 6-year-old daughter Zuri was sitting quietly next to her cousin Bryce. Bryce is Chantel and Trent's biracial son, the undisputed golden grandchild of the family. Whatever Bryce wanted, Bryce received, and the rules never seemed to apply to him. The trouble started over an iPad. Zuri had been sitting patiently playing a drawing game and minding her own business. Bryce decided he wanted to play with it. He did not ask politely or wait for his turn. He just reached over and violently snatched the tablet from her hands, scratching her arm in the process. Zuri, being a confident and self-assured little girl, simply grabbed the edge of the device and pulled it back toward her side of the table. It was a normal childish disagreement, but the reaction it provoked was anything but normal. Before I could even push my chair back to intervene, my mother lunged across the turkey and the side dishes. Her hand struck Zuri's small fingers with a loud, vicious slap that echoed through the entire dining room. The sound was sickening. Zuri gasped, her large brown eyes filling with immediate tears as she clutched her reddened hand to her chest. "Let him have it!" Brenda screamed, her face contorting with rage. "You ungrateful kid!" I felt the blood freeze in my veins. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as I stood up, but before I could utter a single word, my father Calvin shook his head and muttered under his breath. "She is always too loud and aggressive," Calvin said, cutting his steak without even looking at his crying granddaughter. "You need to teach her some discipline, Dominique." Chantel snickered from across the table, taking a slow sip of her red wine, as if she were watching a moderately entertaining television show. Brenda wiped her hand on her expensive linen napkin, as if touching my daughter had somehow soiled her. "She is just an ugly, jealous black girl who needs to learn her place next to Bryce," Brenda muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. They expected me to yell. They expected me to cry or cause a scene so they could label me the angry, emotional failure they always claimed I was. But I did not scream. I did not throw plates or flip the table. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. The kind of clarity that tells you a relationship is permanently, definitively dead. I walked around the table and gently wiped the tears from Zuri's face. I picked her up, kissing her cheek and telling her she was perfectly fine. I retrieved her little wool coat from the hallway, draped it over my arm, and turned back to face my mother. I looked dead into her eyes and let my voice drop to an icy, completely steady register. "Learn her place, Mom," I asked calmly. You mean like how you taught me my place when you drained my entire college savings account to pay for Chantel's $500,000 wedding to Trent? Or maybe you mean how you forced me to sleep in the damp, unfinished basement every holiday just so Bryce can have a dedicated playroom upstairs. You have always hated my dark skin, Mom, and it absolutely kills you to see it on my beautiful daughter. But you just crossed a line that you can never uncross. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, her face flushing with indignant rage, but Trent decided this was the perfect moment to step in and play the white savior peacekeeper. He stood up, putting his hands out in a patronizing, calming gesture. Now, Dominique, let us just calm down, Trent said, using his smooth corporate voice. We are all family here. There is no need to play the race card at Thanksgiving dinner. I turned my gaze to Trent and looked him up and down with utter disgust. Play the race card, I repeated, stepping closer to him. Trent, the only thing being played here is my father's retirement fund, which you have been bleeding dry to float your last 3 failed tech startups. You are a walking bad investment wearing a leased Rolex. Do not ever speak to me or my child again. The color drained entirely from Trent's face. Chantel dropped her wineglass, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. Calvin choked on his food, staring at his son-in-law with sudden dawning horror. I had run a background check on Trent's businesses weeks ago, out of sheer curiosity, and the financial devastation I uncovered was staggering. I had planned to keep it to myself, but they had forfeited my discretion the moment they laid a hand on my child. I did not wait to watch the fallout. I turned my back on the Golden family, leaving them to eat themselves alive in their beautiful, toxic house. I carried Zuri out the front door and down the driveway, the crisp November air feeling like absolute freedom against my skin. I buckled my daughter into her car seat, wiping away her final tears and promising her that we would never step foot in that house again. You are the most beautiful girl in the world, I told her, and nobody will ever make you feel small again. As I closed the car door and slid into the driver's seat, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting a barrage of angry texts from Chantel. Instead, I saw a notification from my email app. It was an urgent message from the executive vice president of a global media conglomerate that I had been negotiating with for the past 8 months. I opened the email and read the subject line. Contract executed, welcome to Times Square, Zuri. I let out a long breath, reading the details of the message. We had done it. I had just officially secured a $10 million merchandising and broadcasting deal for a national commercial campaign called Crown of Curls. The campaign was designed to champion and celebrate dark-skinned Black girls across the country. And the star of this massive nationwide movement, the face that would be on billboards in Times Square and in every Target aisle in America, was my beautiful, amazing 6-year-old daughter, Zuri. I looked at my little girl in the rearview mirror, watching her happily play with her toys, completely unaware that our lives had just changed forever. My toxic family, sitting in their dining room arguing over failed investments and fake prestige, had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. My phone screen illuminated my dark bedroom at 6 in the morning, casting a harsh glow across the ceiling. It was the day after Thanksgiving, and the chaos was exactly what I expected. A solid wall of green text bubbles from Chantel flooded my notifications. I did not even have to open the messages to know her script by heart. She was aggressively accusing me of ruining the family holiday. She claimed Mom was completely inconsolable, crying in her bedroom and dealing with severe blood pressure spikes entirely because of my outburst. Chantel typed paragraph after paragraph stating that I always had to make everything about race, that I was harboring a deep-seated jealousy of her perfect marriage, and that I needed to swallow my bitter pride and apologize to Trent immediately for insulting his businesses. She demanded I bring Zuri back to the house to apologize to Bryce for being selfish over the tablet. I read the toxic words while pouring organic maple syrup over Zuri's warm pancakes in my kitchen. My beautiful daughter was sitting at the granite island, humming a cartoon theme song, completely unharmed and radiating pure joy. I did not type a single letter back. I simply blocked Chantel's number, set my phone face down on the counter, and kissed my daughter on her forehead. The era of me explaining my humanity to people committed to misunderstanding me was permanently closed. By 9 o'clock Monday morning, I was sitting behind the custom marble desk in my corner office. The view stretched endlessly across the downtown skyline, a daily reminder of the empire I built from scratch. My agency represented some of the most influential diverse talent in the country. The walls were lined with striking contemporary art by Black creators, and my staff was a powerhouse of brilliant minds. My parents and my sister genuinely thought I was still fetching coffee, answering phones, and organizing spreadsheets because I deliberately stopped updating them on my career progression 5 years ago. Whenever they asked about work, it was only to mock my paycheck, so I simply let them believe their own arrogant assumptions. My director of human resources, a razor-sharp black woman named Valerie, knocked on my glass door and stepped inside with a highly amused look on her face. Valerie told me there was a frantic, deeply agitated woman named Chantel holding on line 3. Chantel was demanding to speak to my direct supervisor, or the regional management team, immediately. She had spent the last 10 minutes aggressively telling our receptionist that I was a loud, aggressive, and unstable employee who needed to be terminated today for the overall safety of the company. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing off the glass walls of my office. I told Valerie not to hang up, but to transfer my furious sister directly to our lead corporate counsel. I pressed the silent monitor button on my desk phone so I could listen to the absolute destruction of my sister's ego. Chantel launched into her breathless tirade the very second the lawyer answered the line. She used every classic dog whistle term my mother had taught her to weaponize against other Black women. She called me ghetto, unhinged, and a massive financial liability to corporate culture. She demanded that human resources draft my termination papers before lunch, because my violent behavior at a recent family event proved I was entirely unfit for a respectable professional environment. Our lawyer let her completely exhaust her breath and run out of steam before responding with absolute freezing professionalism. He informed Chantel that there was no manager to transfer her to because she was attempting to discipline the founder of the company. I explicitly broke it down for her, explaining that she had contacted the legal department of a multi-million-dollar media group where I was the sole owner and chief executive officer. He even added a helpful piece of trivia, noting that I personally owned the very commercial building she was calling right now, and suggested she direct any further harassment to local law enforcement. There was a sharp, terrified intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the unmistakable click of a panicked hang-up. I sat back in my leather chair and took a slow sip of my sparkling water, enjoying the profound silence in my office. I knew exactly what was happening in the manicured suburbs of Oak Park at that very second. Chantel was absolutely hyperventilating in her driveway. The golden child whose entire identity rested on her proximity to Trent's imaginary wealth and her lifelong superiority over me had just crashed into a solid brick wall of reality. She had dialed the agency expecting to get me fired, strip away my livelihood, and forcefully put me back in my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. Instead, she discovered she was standing in the dirt looking all the way up at a throne I built myself. I knew she was speed dialing our father Calvin right then. She would be stammering out the impossible news that the daughter they treated like a peasant was actually running the kingdom. She would be demanding that Calvin do something to fix this unnatural shift in the universe. Just before noon, my private cell phone rang loudly. It was an unknown number flashing on the screen. Calvin always used a blocked caller ID or a burner phone from his office when he wanted to ambush me, so I could not screen his calls. I answered the phone without saying a single word, letting the silence force his hand. Calvin did not say hello. He did not ask how Zuri was doing, or if her hand was bruised from the slap. He certainly did not apologize for his wife striking a 6-year-old child across the face over a plastic toy. Instead, he barked a direct order with the same dismissive, unyielding authority he had used to control me my entire life. He told me to get down to his private bank downtown before 3 o'clock that afternoon. Trent was in what Calvin described as a minor temporary financial bind, and Calvin needed me to co-sign a massive business loan immediately. He claimed the bank just needed a secondary signature with a flawless, clean credit history to clear a small administrative hurdle. He spoke with a casual, aggressive tone, as if Thanksgiving had never happened, as if I were still the obedient, terrified scapegoat, desperate for his paternal validation. They did not just want me back in line, they wanted to use my pristine credit and my name to save his entitled white son-in-law from a mountain of toxic debt. The voice on the other end of the line did not offer a greeting. My father Calvin simply started issuing directives as if I were a disobedient intern who had forgotten to file his morning reports. He bypassed any mention of Thanksgiving, completely ignoring the fact that his wife had physically assaulted his granddaughter just days prior. Instead, he launched straight into a meticulously rehearsed speech about family loyalty and financial obligations. He informed me that Trent had hit a temporary snag with his latest tech venture and desperately needed $250,000 to cover immediate operating costs. According to Calvin, the banks were being unreasonably strict, and Trent just needed a co-signer with a flawless credit history to push the paperwork through. Calvin explained that his own liquid assets were currently tied up in a pending corporate merger, which left me as the only viable option to save Chantel's perfect lifestyle. I listened to the sound of his breathing through the receiver, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man. When I did not immediately offer my signature, Calvin mistook my silence for submission. He lowered his voice, adopting the paternal tone he always used when he was about to deliver a threat. He told me that family helps family Dominique, and that if I chose to be selfish and abandon my sister in her time of need, he would have no choice but to formally remove me from the family trust. He threatened to cut me out of his will, completely leaving me with absolutely nothing when he passed away. He actually believed this was a masterstroke of manipulation. He thought he was dangling my entire future by a thread, waiting for me to beg for his financial grace. I let out a loud, genuine laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. The sound was sharp and completely devoid of humor. Calvin stammered into the phone, clearly thrown off balance by my reaction. I cut him off before he could try to regain his footing. I told him he was incredibly forgetful for a man who prided himself on details. I reminded him that he had already cut me out of the will exactly a decade ago. I painted the picture for him, crystal clear, reminding him of the day. I refused to chemically straighten my natural hair for his pristine Oak Park Country Club directory photos. He had called me an embarrassment to his public image that day and explicitly told me I would not see a dime of his money. I asked him how he could possibly threaten me with the loss of an inheritance that had been revoked 10 years ago over a box of hair relaxer. Calvin tried to backtrack, sputtering something about how we could repair our relationship if I just showed some solidarity with Trent. I stopped him cold. I told him that Trent's $250,000 debt was his own miserable problem to solve. I reminded him that Trent was the same man who stood in my dining room and told me to calm down after my mother struck my dark-skinned child across the face. I told Calvin that I would rather set my pristine credit score on fire than use it to bail out a mediocre entitled man who bled his own father-in-law dry. I advised Calvin to look much closer at Trent's accounting books before he lost everything he owned, and then I ended the call without waiting for his response. Dropping the phone onto my desk, I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline. I did not waste another second thinking about Calvin or his desperate golden son-in-law. I walked over to the leather chair opposite my desk and picked up the thick stack of legal documents waiting for my signature. This was not just a commercial contract anymore. Over the weekend, my legal team had ruthlessly negotiated the terms, elevating the project into a $10 million merchandising and broadcasting partnership. The campaign was called Crown of Curls. It was a massive live-action media movement specifically designed to champion, celebrate, and elevate dark-skinned Black girls. And my daughter Zuri was the undisputed star. I picked up my favorite gold pen and signed my name on the final page of the contract, sealing the deal. This was my ultimate counterstrike. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small because of my complexion, and they had tried to pass that same toxic generational trauma down to my daughter. They wanted Zuri to believe she was ugly and unworthy just because she did not look like Chantel's biracial son. But I was not going to fight them with arguments or screaming matches. I was going to fight them with systemic, undeniable visibility. I was going to put my dark-skinned daughter on the highest pedestal in media and force the entire country to witness her absolute perfection. The next morning, the production studio was a whirlwind of brilliant, focused energy. I had personally rented out one of the most exclusive sound stages in the city and hired a production crew that represented the absolute best of black excellence in the industry. Walking onto the set, I felt a fierce protective pride welling up in my chest. The environment was a stark, beautiful contrast to the toxic hostility of my parents' home. Here there were no cold stares or backhanded compliments. The entire space was designed to make Zuri feel like absolute royalty. I watched from my director's chair as Zuri arrived on set, holding the hand of her personal wardrobe assistant. She was practically glowing. The hairstylists I hired were absolute masters of natural textures. They did not try to pull tug or flatten her hair. Instead, they treated her thick, tight coils like spun gold, shaping them into a magnificent towering crown that framed her joyful face. The wardrobe department had pulled racks of custom clothing specifically designed to complement her rich brown skin. They dressed her in vibrant jewel tones, deep emerald greens, brilliant sapphire blues, and radiant golds that made her look like a tiny queen. The music pumping through the studio speakers was upbeat and empowering. The director, a visionary black woman I had specifically requested, knelt down to Zuri's eye level and spoke to her with incredible respect and kindness. She told Zuri to just be herself, to laugh loud, to dance, and to show the cameras how much she loved her beautiful hair. Zuri stepped under the massive studio lights, completely unfazed by the cameras or the crew. She was in her element, spinning around in a bright yellow tulle dress and laughing a pure, uninhibited sound that filled the entire soundstage. Every time I looked at her spinning under those lights, I thought about the damp, unfinished basement my mother tried to force us into every holiday. I thought about the way Brenda wiped her hand on a napkin after touching my child. They wanted Zuri to hide in the shadows, but here she was, literally bathed in spotlights, surrounded by professionals who were dedicated to capturing her beauty. The crew treated her with absolute reverence, cheering her on after every single take. There was no Bryce to compete with, no Chantel to sneer at her, and no Calvin to demand she be quiet. She was the center of the universe, and she knew it. As the final shot wrapped, the entire crew erupted into massive applause. Zuri ran over to me, throwing her arms around my neck and burying her face in my shoulder. She told me she felt like a princess, and I held her tightly, promising her that she would always be treated exactly like one. As I was holding my daughter, my lead marketing director practically sprinted across the soundstage toward my chair. He was clutching his tablet tightly to his chest and breathing heavily, as if he had just run a marathon. He stopped in front of me and lowered his voice, fighting to contain a massive grin. He told me that our media buying team had just pulled off the impossible. They had been negotiating behind closed doors for the past 48 hours, leveraging every single industry connection my agency possessed. He turned the tablet around to show me the finalized broadcast schedule. We did not just secure a good primetime slot, we secured the absolute pinnacle of television advertising. The marketing director confirmed that the Crown of Curls campaign premiere was officially locked in. The commercial was scheduled to air tomorrow night, precisely during the first commercial break of the single most watched television event of the entire year. Millions upon millions of viewers across the country would be tuning in, and sitting right in their living rooms, surrounded by their fragile lives and least luxury, my status-obsessed parents and my deeply insecure sister would have absolutely no choice but to watch my daughter claim her crown. Sunday night arrived with the kind of electric anticipation that only precedes a cultural reset. The most watched television event of the year was midway through its broadcast when the screens suddenly went completely dark. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence across millions of American living rooms. Then a single spotlight illuminated the screen. There, standing in the center of a massive soundstage, was my 6-year-old daughter Zuri. She was wearing a vibrant emerald gown that contrasted beautifully with her rich dark skin. Her natural hair stood in a magnificent untamed crown of coils. She looked directly into the camera and delivered a smile so pure and radiant it could have melted ice. The voiceover began, spoken by a legendary black actress, talking about the power of embracing your authentic self, the royalty inherent in dark skin, and the undisputed magic of natural hair. The commercial transitioned into a stunning montage of Zuri painting, dancing, and wearing a literal golden crown. The words "Crown of Curls" flashed across the screen, followed by the logo of our massive corporate partner. It took exactly 4 minutes for the internet to completely break. By the time the broadcast returned from the commercial break, the campaign was trending #1 worldwide on every social media platform. My phone began vibrating so violently, it nearly vibrated right off my kitchen counter. Industry colleagues, celebrities, and marketing executives were flooding my inbox with congratulations. By Monday morning, Zuri was a national sensation. Major morning talk shows dedicated their entertainment segments to discussing the groundbreaking campaign. Massive digital billboards went live in Times Square, downtown Los Angeles and Chicago, featuring Zuri's beautiful glowing face looking down over the bustling cities. Industry blogs quickly leaked the details of the unprecedented $10 million merchandising and broadcasting deal. My little girl, the one my mother had slapped and called ugly just days prior, was now the wealthiest, most famous 6-year-old in the country. Back in the manicured, painfully pretentious suburb of Oak Park, Brenda and Calvin were having a very different kind of Monday morning. They were sitting in their pristine living room drinking their imported coffee when Brenda's phone began to ring. It was Sister Thomas from their incredibly judgmental country club church congregation. Brenda answered, expecting the usual gossip, but instead she was met with a high-pitched squeal of excitement. Sister Thomas could not stop gushing about how absolutely gorgeous Brenda's granddaughter looked on national television. She asked why Brenda had never mentioned that Zuri was a child star. Before Brenda could even process the confusion, Calvin's phone began ringing. It was a senior partner at his failing firm, congratulating him on his granddaughter's massive new corporate deal. Calvin rushed to his tablet and typed my daughter's name into the search bar. The color must have completely drained from their faces when the search results populated. Right there on the screen were dozens of articles detailing the historic $10 million contract. They saw the billboards, the glowing reviews, and the sheer magnitude of the wealth that had just been secured. Suddenly, the dark skin and natural hair they had spent years mocking were no longer a source of shame. In the twisted colorist logic of my parents, those traits had magically transformed into a verified commodity. The colorism vanished, instantly replaced by a frantic, desperate greed. The ugly grandchild was now a multimillionaire, and they were completely cut off from the money. I was sitting in my home office sipping my morning tea when the notifications began to roll in. 1 missed call from Mom, then 5, then 12. Within a single hour, I had 40 missed calls from Brenda and at least 20 from Calvin. My voicemail inbox filled up with messages that made my stomach turn. Brenda's voice dripped with a sickening artificial sweetness that I had never once heard directed at me during my entire childhood. She left messages calling me her darling daughter and referring to Zuri as her precious, beautiful little angel. Calvin left voicemails using his booming patriarchal voice, demanding that I call him back immediately so we could discuss proper wealth management for his granddaughter's new income stream. They completely ignored the fact that they had physically assaulted my child and verbally degraded her just last week. They genuinely believed that their biological titles granted them an all-access pass to my daughter's newly acquired fortune. I did not return a single call. I simply blocked both of their numbers and went back to reviewing my agency contracts. But Brenda and Calvin were never the type to take silence for an answer, especially not when $10 million was on the line. I live in a highly secure gated community with 24-hour security guards and strict guest protocols. My parents knew they were permanently banned from the premises after the Thanksgiving incident. But desperation makes toxic people incredibly creative. Just after lunchtime, my intercom buzzed. It was Marcus, the head of neighborhood security, sounding extremely stressed. He apologized for interrupting my workday, but informed me that my parents had just breached the front gate. According to Marcus, my mother had pulled up to the security booth in absolute hysterics, screaming that Calvin was having a massive cardiac episode in the passenger seat. She claimed they were passing by my neighborhood when his chest seized, and she needed immediate access to my home because she knew I kept a medical defibrillator in my home gym. It was a spectacular, disgusting lie. They weaponized a fake medical emergency just to bypass the security protocols and force their way onto my property. Marcus told me he had called an ambulance to follow them, but my parents were already speeding up the winding road toward my private driveway. I felt a cold surge of absolute fury coursing through my veins. The sheer audacity required to fake a heart attack just to ambush me at my own home was staggering even for them. I instructed Marcus to cancel the ambulance and informed him that I would handle the intruders myself. I walked out the heavy oak double doors of my house and stepped onto the immaculate cobblestone driveway. The midday sun was bright, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. I crossed my arms over my chest and waited. Seconds later, my parents' leased silver Mercedes came screeching around the corner, taking the curve far too fast. The car slammed to a halt right in front of me, tires squealing against the pavement. The doors flung open, and the performance of a lifetime began. Calvin, the man who was supposedly having a fatal cardiac episode just 3 minutes ago, hopped out of the passenger seat looking completely perfectly healthy. But it was Brenda who truly committed to the role. She rushed out of the driver's side, practically running toward me. She was wearing one of her expensive country club dresses, but her face was crumpled into an expression of theatrical manufactured agony. In her hands, she was clutching a small bouquet of cheap plastic-wrapped carnations that she had clearly grabbed from a grocery store checkout lane on their frantic drive over. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. They were fake tears of joy, forced and completely hollow, designed to guilt me into submission. She held the cheap flowers out toward me, gasping for air, as if she had been weeping for hours. She looked at me with those desperate, calculating eyes, preparing to deliver whatever manipulative speech she had rehearsed in the car. I stood perfectly still on my driveway, staring back at the woman who had slapped my daughter, my expression completely unreadable, ready to utterly destroy her illusion. Brenda practically tripped over her own expensive designer heels as she hurried across the immaculate cobblestones of my driveway. The crinkling plastic wrapping of her cheap grocery store carnations sounded deafening in the quiet afternoon air of my gated community. She threw her arms open wide, her face stretched into a grotesque mask of absolute adoration that made my stomach churn. She had clearly been crying, but the tears tracking through her expensive foundation were completely manufactured. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, and if I did not know the monster hiding beneath that cashmere sweater, I might have actually believed she was a loving grandmother. "Dominique, my darling girl," Brenda cried out, her voice echoing off the pristine facades of the surrounding mansions. "We saw the commercial. We saw our beautiful, precious granddaughter on national television last night. Oh, we are just so incredibly proud of our little star. I cannot believe you kept this wonderful secret from us. Come here and give your mother a hug." I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground like a fortress built of stone and ice. As she reached out to wrap her arms around my shoulders, I took one deliberate step back and put my hand up, flat, rigid, and absolute. The physical block was so abrupt and unyielding that Brenda actually stumbled forward, catching her balance with a sharp, offended gasp. The fake smile immediately slipped from her face, replaced by a flash of genuine indignation. She was completely unaccustomed to being denied access to anything she wanted. "Do not take another step toward me," I said, my voice dropping to a register so cold it could have frozen the air between us. "Do not try to touch me, and do not ever refer to my daughter as your precious angel." Brenda clutched the cheap flowers to her chest, her eyes darting around the driveway as if she were worried my wealthy neighbors might be watching us through their windows. "Dominique, please," she whispered urgently. "Why are you acting like this? We came all this way to celebrate Zuri's amazing success. We are family." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that forced her to take another step back. "3 days ago, she was an ugly black kid," I said, repeating her exact vile words from the Thanksgiving dinner table. "3 days ago, you slapped her across the face over a plastic toy and told me she needed to learn her place. You looked at her rich, dark skin and her tight, natural curls, and you saw something you despised. You saw everything you have spent your entire life trying to erase from our family bloodline. Your deeply ingrained colorism did not magically vanish overnight, Mom. You did not wake up this morning and suddenly discover a deep love for black features. Your colorism just saw a $10 million price tag broadcast in Times Square and decided it was finally time to play nice. Brenda opened her mouth to deny it, her face flushing a deep mottled red, but before she could formulate another toxic lie, a heavy car door slammed shut behind her. Calvin had apparently decided his fake cardiac episode had run its course. He marched up the driveway, his chest puffed out and his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. He was using the exact same physical intimidation tactics he had used to terrorize me when I was a teenager. He expected me to cower, to lower my eyes and submit to his booming patriarchal authority. "You will not speak to your mother with that tone of voice," Calvin demanded, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "We drove over here to support you, and you are acting like an ungrateful child. Now you listen to me, Dominique, and you listen closely. You are completely out of your depth here. A television deal of this magnitude involves complex financial structuring, tax shelters, and corporate negotiations that you cannot possibly comprehend on your own." He stepped closer, trying to tower over me, but I did not flinch. Calvin continued his arrogant lecture, completely convinced that I was just a naive single mother who had somehow stumbled into a mountain of blind luck. "I demand that you give me the direct contact information for whoever negotiated this commercial contract," he barked. "I need to speak to Zuri's management team immediately. I am going to step in and ensure this money is being properly sheltered in the family trust before you let some Hollywood agency rob my granddaughter blind. We are going to take control of the situation today." I stared at the man who had actively ignored my existence for a decade. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was breathtaking. He actually believed that a white corporate agent had discovered Zuri and orchestrated this massive campaign. I thought I was just a bystander in my own daughter's success story. He wanted to swoop in, push me aside, take control of the finances, and undoubtedly funnel Zuri's hard-earned millions directly into his own failing business ventures to save his precious son-in-law Trent. "You want to speak to her management?" "Calvin," I asked, tilting my head and offering him a smile that was completely devoid of warmth. "You are looking at her." Calvin's aggressive posture faltered. He blinked, staring at me, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Excuse me," he muttered. "I own the agency, Calvin," I said, spelling it out for him with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "I built the media company. I represent the talent. I personally negotiated the $10 million broadcast and merchandising contract with the corporate executives. There is no outside management team for you to bully, and there is absolutely no family trust for you to siphon from. You do not get to degrade my daughter on Thursday, and then try to act as her financial savior on Monday. I handle every single aspect of Zuri's life and career. And as of this exact moment, you and your wife are permanently banned from these premises." I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the direct line to the neighborhood security booth. "Marcus," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on my father. "The medical emergency at my residence was completely fabricated. The intruders are hostile, and they are refusing to leave my property. Please send the patrol vehicle immediately to escort them out." Brenda let out a small, terrified shriek, dropping the plastic-wrapped carnations onto the cobblestones. Calvin turned a shade of pale gray, realizing that his patriarchal bluster held absolutely zero power in my jurisdiction. I was standing on my property, looking at a daughter who possessed more wealth, power, and industry influence than he had ever achieved in his entire mediocre life. He opened his mouth to try and negotiate, to backpedal and salvage some shred of his shattered ego. But the sound of his voice was completely drowned out by the sudden violent screeching of tires. A sleek silver-leased Mercedes came tearing around the corner of the quiet suburban street, driving with reckless, unhinged aggression. The car swerved wildly, hitting the edge of my manicured lawn, before slamming on the brakes right behind my parents' vehicle. The driver's side door flew open, and Trent stumbled out looking like a man who had not slept in days. His usually perfect hair was a mess, his designer shirt was wrinkled, and there was a manic, desperate energy radiating from his entire body. Chantel scrambled out of the passenger side, her makeup smeared and her face puffy from crying. Trent did not even look at Calvin or Brenda. He stormed straight up my driveway, waving a thick manila legal folder violently in the air. I was breathing heavily, his eyes wide and panicked. You think you are so smart? Dominique Trent screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. You think you can just steal my intellectual property and cut me out of the deal? I gave you the idea for that campaign years ago, and this folder proves it. I am not leaving this driveway until you sign over 30% of the royalties. Trent closes the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. He is a tall man who is entirely too accustomed to using his physical presence to intimidate women into compliance. He practically shoves Brenda out of the way to stand directly in my personal space. The manila folder in his hand is shaking from the force of his white-knuckled grip. He looks down his nose at me, his face flushed an angry mottled red, and barks that I am not nearly as clever as I think I am. He claims that I deliberately stole his proprietary intellectual property to launch the Crown of Curls campaign. I just stare at him, letting the sheer absurdity of his statement hang in the crisp afternoon air. Trent takes my silence as an invitation to keep digging his own grave. He points a finger directly at my face and loudly details a completely fabricated version of history. According to Trent, during a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, he had casually mentioned that the ethnic hair care market was an untapped goldmine and suggested I should monetize Zuri's look. He claims this passing arrogant comment makes him the sole visionary behind my $10 million enterprise. He puffs out his chest and declares that his legal team is already drafting the paperwork to seize 30% of Zuri's royalties because I allegedly plagiarized his corporate strategy. Chantel steps up right beside him, crossing her arms and offering me a smug, victorious sneer. She tells me that I should have known better than to try and outsmart a real businessman. She demands that I sign over the 30% immediately, or they will tie my agency up in litigation for the next decade. Calvin nods in agreement, stepping forward to stand behind his golden son-in-law. Calvin tells me that Trent is offering me a very generous settlement, and that I should be grateful he is keeping this internal, rather than pressing criminal charges. They are all standing on my property, actively conspiring to extort money from a 6-year-old child, and they genuinely believe they have the upper hand. When I do not immediately drop to my knees and beg for mercy, Trent decides to escalate his tactics. He lowers his voice, adopting a venomous, threatening tone. He leans in so close I can smell the stale coffee and panic on his breath. He tells me that if I refuse to pay him his rightful share, he is going straight to the media. He threatens to call every major industry blog, every news outlet, and every corporate sponsor tied to the campaign. He tells me exactly how he will frame the narrative. He will paint me as a bitter, desperate single mother who stole a brilliant business model from her successful white brother-in-law. He promises to spin a story of reverse discrimination and intellectual property theft that will absolutely destroy my professional reputation. He says he will file an emergency injunction to freeze all of the campaign assets, effectively halting Zuri's entire media rollout before the weekend. He is practically vibrating with malicious excitement, thrilled at the prospect of financially ruining the niece he could not even be bothered to defend a few days prior. I do not raise my voice. I do not flinch. I do not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I simply maintain unbroken eye contact with Trent as I reach into the sleek leather folio tucked under my left arm. I pull out my tablet and tap the screen, turning the brightness all the way up so there is no chance he can misread the text. I pull up the official database for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I hold the screen up right in front of Trent's face, forcing him to look at the undeniable, irrefutable proof of his own pathetic delusion. I tell him to read the dates aloud. When he simply stares at the screen with his mouth hanging slightly open, I read them for him. I point out the official filing date for the Crown of Curls trademark. I show him the copyright registrations for the branding, the logo designs, and the initial corporate entity formations. Every single legal document on that screen is stamped and verified from exactly 4 years and 2 months ago. I calmly remind Trent that 4 years and 2 months ago, he was still working as a mid-level logistics manager, wearing cheap suits and driving a leased Honda. I remind him that 4 years and 2 months ago, he had not even swiped right on my sister's dating profile yet. I watch the color completely drain from Trent's face as the mathematical impossibility of his extortion attempt crashes down on him. The manila folder in his hand suddenly looks incredibly flimsy and pathetic. I tell him that his claim is not just legally baseless, but chronologically hilarious. I inform him that if he attempts to go to the media with his fabricated story, my corporate legal team will counter-sue him for defamation, extortion, and emotional distress before he even finishes dialing the phone. I promise him that I will personally ensure he never works in the corporate sector again. Chantel realizes the extortion plan has just evaporated into thin air. She looks at Trent, her eyes wide with sudden panic, demanding to know if he actually has a lawyer. Trent cannot even look at her. He is staring at the cobblestones, suddenly looking very small and very afraid. Calvin, however, is still struggling to catch up to the reality of the situation. He steps forward, his brow furrowed in confusion, trying to reassert his authority. Calvin demands to know what is going on and tells me I still need to show respect to my brother-in-law. I pivot my attention entirely to Calvin locking eyes with the man who had threatened to disinherit me just 24 hours ago. I tell Calvin that his timing could not possibly be better. I remind him of the phone call he made yesterday morning. The call where he demanded I blindly sign my name as a guarantor on a $250,000 business loan to save Trent from a temporary snag. I explained to Calvin that I run a highly successful international media agency, and part of my job requires absolute ruthlessness when it comes to financial liability. I tell him that when a mediocre man asks for access to my pristine credit score, I do not just take his word for it. I inform my father that immediately following his threatening phone call, I deployed my agency's top forensic accountants and a private corporate investigator to look into Trent's supposedly minor cash flow problem. I did a full comprehensive audit of the man Calvin considered his superior son-in-law. I tell Calvin that Trent is not experiencing a temporary operational delay. Trent's entire business structure is a mirage built on a mountain of toxic debt, high-interest predatory loans, and severely misappropriated investor funds. I detail how Trent has been systematically draining his business accounts to fund Chantel's luxury car leases, her designer handbags, and their country club memberships, while defaulting on his actual corporate obligations. Trent is absolutely hyperventilating now, taking desperate steps backward toward his car, as if he can physically run away from the truth. Chantel is gripping the side of the Mercedes, looking like she is going to be physically ill. I tell Calvin that Trent did not need a cosigner to expand his business. He needed a cosigner to prevent his original investors from filing federal fraud charges against him by the end of the month. He wanted to use my name, my money, and my flawless credit history as a human shield to absorb the impact of his own criminal negligence. Calvin is staring at Trent, his jaw tight and his hands balled into fists. The illusion of his perfect, wealthy son-in-law has been completely shattered, replaced by the reality of a desperate con artist who was willing to drag the entire family down with him. Brenda is standing completely frozen, the forgotten grocery store carnations lying crushed on the driveway beneath her feet. The entire power dynamic of the family hierarchy has been completely inverted in the span of 10 minutes. I reach back into my leather folio and pull out a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. It contains every single page of the forensic audit, every bank statement, every hidden loan document, and every piece of evidence, proving exactly how Trent has been funding his fake lifestyle. I walk forward and press the heavy envelope directly into Calvin's chest, forcing him to take it. I look him dead in the eye, my expression entirely devoid of sympathy or hesitation. You might want to see how your son-in-law has been funding his lifestyle, Calvin. Calvin tore at the heavy flap of the manila envelope, his thick fingers fumbling clumsily with the metal clasp. He pulled out a dense stack of printed financial records and legal disclosures. I had explicitly instructed my forensic accounting team to highlight the most egregious offenses in bright crimson ink, so there would be absolutely no room for misinterpretation. Calvin flipped to the first page, his eyes darting across the top column. I watched the exact second his lifelong arrogance completely fractured. His face, which just moments ago had been set in a mask of patriarchal authority, suddenly drained of all color before flushing a dangerous mottled shade of plum. I was staring directly at a series of unauthorized wire transfers. The documents showed crystal clear routing numbers, pulling massive sums of money directly from Calvin's private corporate retirement accounts and funneling them straight into Trent's offshore shell companies. Trent had utilized his proximity to Calvin, leveraging his status as the trusted son-in-law to gain administrative access to Calvin's personal financial portfolios. Calvin flipped to the second page, his hands beginning to shake violently. He was looking at his own forged signature on a series of aggressive bridge loans that Trent had secretly secured against Calvin's remaining equity. Calvin flipped to the third page, then the fourth, his breathing growing heavy and erratic. He was reading the true metrics of Trent's fake tech startup. The documents proved that Trent's business generated absolutely zero revenue. It was a hollow shell, a financial black hole designed solely to siphon money from unsuspecting investors and pump it directly into Trent and Chantel's lavish personal checking accounts. Calvin reached the final summary page and saw the total amount missing. Trent had not just stolen $250,000. He had systematically drained Calvin's entire life savings. The foundation of my parents' immaculate Oak Park lifestyle, the money Calvin had hoarded and lorded over me my entire life, was completely gone. Trent, you parasitic coward! Calvin breathed the words barely escaping his throat. Trent took another desperate step backward, his expensive leather loafers scraping against the cobblestones. He held his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender, sweat visibly rolling down his temples and staining the collar of his designer shirt. Calvin, it was just a temporary reallocation of liquid assets. Trent stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own guilt. I was going to put it all back. The startup just needed a longer runway to reach profitability. The market shifted, and I had to pivot the operational capital to maintain our overhead. I swear to you, every single dime was going to be returned before the quarter ended, Calvin snapped. The sophisticated country club patriarch completely lost his mind right there in the midday sun. He lunged forward with a guttural roar, grabbing Trent by the lapels of his wrinkled shirt and slamming him hard against the side of the leased Mercedes. Trent let out a high-pitched yelp of pure terror, cowering against the tinted windows and weakly trying to pry Calvin's thick hands off his neck. Calvin shook him violently, screaming that Trent had ruined him, demanding to know where his retirement money was, and threatening to kill him with his bare hands. Chantel absolutely lost her mind, but she did not turn her fury toward the man who had just bankrupted her father. The golden child, deeply conditioned to avoid accountability, instantly turned her unhinged rage entirely on me. She stomped across the driveway, her face contorted with hysterical fury, and pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. You are a liar, Chantel shrieked, her voice pitching into a shrill, deafening frequency. You fabricated all of this. You paid some illegal hackers to doctor these bank statements just to ruin my perfect marriage. You are so bitterly jealous of me, Dominique. You have always been jealous of my husband and my life. You cannot stand the fact that Trent is a visionary, and you are just a miserable, lonely single mother. You are trying to frame him to cover up the fact that you stole his intellectual property for your stupid little commercial. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air between her delusional accusations. She honestly believed that I had manufactured federal bank fraud documents simply out of spite. She refused to look at the paperwork scattered on the ground. She refused to acknowledge that her luxury car, her designer wardrobe, and her entire identity were funded by stolen money. She lunged forward desperately, trying to pull Calvin off her husband, screaming that I was a monster who was tearing our beautiful family apart. The pristine driveway of my gated community had become the stage for their absolute destruction. The golden family was eating itself alive right in front of me. Calvin was pinning a weeping, terrified Trent against the car hood. Chantel was sobbing hysterically, yanking on Calvin's arm and screaming obscenities at me. They looked exactly like the chaotic, unstable people they had always accused me of being. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my tailored trousers, watching the collapse of their fraudulent empire with cold, clinical detachment. Brenda could not handle the public humiliation. She looked frantically up and down the street, terrified that my wealthy neighbors or the security guards might be witnessing this ghetto display. The prospect of social embarrassment was far more horrifying to her than the fact that her son-in-law was a federal criminal. She stepped right into the middle of the physical altercation, shoving her hands against Calvin's chest and demanding that he let Trent go immediately. She ordered them to stop making a scene and to handle this like respectable, civilized people. When Calvin finally released his grip, letting Trent slide down the side of the Mercedes to catch his breath, Brenda turned her furious, tear-streaked face toward me. She straightened her posture, smoothing down her cashmere sweater in a desperate bid to reclaim her evaporating superiority. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "Take your fake documents and your dirty money and go straight to hell, Dominique." Brenda spat, her voice trembling with manufactured pride. "We do not need your help. We do not need your little commercial money, and we certainly do not need your disgusting charity. You think you have won because you printed out some spreadsheets to scare us. You think you can use this to finally put yourself above your sister. But you are wrong. You will always be second best in this family." She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest and pointing a finger at the ground. "We are completely fine," Brenda declared arrogantly. "Calvin's company is in the final stages of a massive corporate buyout. We have been negotiating this merger for months. They love Calvin. The board of directors practically begged him to sign the contract. The buyout is going to inject millions upon millions of dollars directly into our accounts. It will replace whatever Trent borrowed tenfold. We are going to be richer than you could ever possibly dream of being, and you will not see a single solitary cent of that wealth." She practically vibrated with triumphant energy, thrilled to have found a lifeline to cling to. She thought this corporate merger was her ultimate trump card, her guaranteed ticket back to the top of the social hierarchy. She stepped closer to me, delivering her final fatal boast. "The firm buying Calvin's company is going to secure our legacy forever," Brenda announced proudly, practically spitting the words in my face. "Sterling Acquisitions. That is the name of the holding firm. They are acquiring Calvin's entire portfolio by the end of the month, so you can take your little agency and your dark-skinned child and stay out of our lives. Sterling Acquisitions is going to make us untouchable." I did not interrupt her. I let her finish her entire frantic, desperate monologue. I let the silence settle over the driveway, broken only by Trent's pathetic sniffling and Chantel's heavy breathing. I looked at Brenda, then shifted my gaze to Calvin, who was straightening his suit jacket and attempting to regain his shattered dignity. I tilted my head slightly and offered them a slow, chilling smile. "You mean Sterling Acquisitions?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of empathy. "The private holding firm based out of Delaware. The one currently finalizing the hostile takeover of your failing logistics company." Calvin froze. His hands stopped moving. He stared at me, his eyes widening as a new, terrifying realization began to dawn on him. "You might want to look up who the majority shareholder of Sterling Acquisitions is," I said, holding his gaze. Brenda physically stumbles backward, the blood draining so rapidly from her face that she looks practically translucent in the afternoon light. Her expensive designer heels catch on the uneven edge of my cobblestone driveway, and she has to grab the side mirror of Trent's leased Mercedes to keep from completely collapsing onto the ground. Her mouth opens and closes in rapid succession, but her vocal cords refuse to produce a single coherent sound of denial. The absolute certainty in my voice has entirely short-circuited her carefully constructed reality. Calvin is completely consumed by a sudden violent wave of panic that overrides every ounce of his remaining patriarchal pride. He plunges his thick hand into his tailored suit jacket and yanks out his smartphone. His fingers, usually so precise and commanding, are visibly trembling as he fumbles to unlock the screen. He pulls up his web browser, his frantic typing completely devoid of his usual polished grace. He is searching the corporate registry, desperately looking for the public federal filings for Sterling Acquisitions. I stand perfectly still, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my tailored trousers, and I watch him sweat. I watch the precise second the search results load on his high-resolution screen. His eyes dart back and forth across the glowing display, reading the corporate hierarchy. He sees the parent company name. He sees the board of directors. And right at the very top, listed as the sole primary shareholder and chief executive officer, he sees my name, Dominique. The expensive smartphone slips from Calvin's trembling grasp and clatters onto the driveway, the glass screen cracking violently against the hard stone. He does not even reach down to pick it up. He just stares at me, his chest heaving, his entire reality crumbling into dust around his expensive Italian leather shoes. Yes, Calvin. I say, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a freshly sharpened blade. I am Sterling Acquisitions. I built the parent holding company 3 years ago to diversify my agency revenue streams and shelter my corporate assets. I am the anonymous corporate entity that your board of directors has been begging for a financial bailout. I am the buyer who holds the absolute fate of your entire failing logistics business in the palm of my hand. Brenda lets out a sound that is half gasp, half sob. But we are your family, she croaks out, her voice stripped of all its previous arrogance and venom. You cannot just buy your father's company and treat us like this. It is a massive conflict of interest. Dominique, you have to stop this right now. I turn my gaze to her, and the sheer coldness in my eyes makes her physically recoil. There is no conflict, Brenda, I inform her smoothly, because there is no family here. There is only a severely mismanaged logistics firm drowning in toxic debt and the corporate buyer who is stepping in to strip it down for parts. For years, you and Calvin treated my existence as a liability. You told everyone I was a disappointment who would never amount to anything. You laughed when I started my media agency in a cramped one-bedroom apartment while you showered Trent and Chantel with investment capital. Now you are staring down the barrel of total financial ruin, and the only person standing between you and absolute bankruptcy is the daughter you tried to erase. Calvin is breathing heavily, his face a terrifying shade of pale gray. He looks at me not as a father looking at a daughter, but as a defeated man looking at his executioner. Dominique, he starts, his voice cracking under the weight of his utter humiliation. We can negotiate this. We can restructure the merger terms to keep the assets internal. I can offer you a permanent seat on the executive board. I can make you a full partner. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoes loudly across the manicured lawns of my quiet neighborhood. You do not have the leverage to offer me anything. Calvin, I state firmly, stepping closer to him so he can fully absorb the reality of his situation. You are not negotiating from a position of power. You are a desperate man standing on my property begging for a lifeline because your golden son-in-law embezzled your entire retirement fund to finance a fraudulent tech startup. I check the sleek silver watch on my wrist, making a deliberate show of checking the time. Your formal acquisition meeting with the Sterling executive team is scheduled for tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I will be sitting at the head of that conference table. You will walk into my boardroom, and you will sign the unconditional surrender of your entire corporate portfolio exactly as my legal team has drafted it. I point a finger directly at his chest, tapping it against his expensive silk tie. If you attempt to alter a single clause of the buyout agreement, the deal is dead. If you try to negotiate a golden parachute for yourself, the deal is dead. And Calvin, if you are even one single minute late to that 9 o'clock meeting, I will pull the acquisition offer completely off the table. I will let your company default on its high-interest loans. I will watch your creditors dismantle your life's work piece by piece, and I will personally buy the remaining assets out of foreclosure for pennies on the dollar. Do you understand me? Calvin swallows hard, his throat bobbing. The man who had terrorized me for my entire childhood is completely broken, stripped of every ounce of his patriarchal authority. He gives me a single slow nod of submission. The sound of a car engine roaring to life shatters the tense silence. Trent, who has been cowering against the side of his vehicle this entire time, has suddenly realized that Calvin's money is gone, and my legal team is about to annihilate him. He scrambles into the driver's seat of his leased Mercedes, slamming the door shut with a violent metallic crack. Chantel spins around, her tear-streaked face twisting in sudden panic. "Trent, what are you doing?" she screams, lunging toward the car door and pulling frantically on the locked handle. "Open the door, Trent. We have to call a lawyer. We have to fix this." Trent does not even look at his wife. The man who spent years presenting himself as a brilliant tech visionary is nothing but a terrified coward running from the consequences of his own federal crimes. He throws the car into reverse, the tires screeching and burning rubber against my pristine cobblestone driveway. He violently jerks the steering wheel, practically clipping Chantel's leg as he swerves backward into the street. Chantel stumbles, falling hard onto her knees as Trent shifts into drive and speeds away down the suburban road, leaving his wife completely abandoned in the dust. Chantel lets out a gut-wrenching wail, burying her face in her hands as she kneels on the hard stone. She is sobbing hysterically. Her perfect blowout ruined her designer dress stained with dirt. Her fake perfect marriage has just evaporated in front of her eyes, along with her entire financial future. Calvin does not even attempt to comfort his favorite daughter. He is entirely consumed by his own impending doom. He grabs Brenda by the arm, his grip harsh and unforgiving, and practically drags her toward their own vehicle. Brenda is openly weeping now, her pristine country club facade completely demolished. She stumbles alongside him, casting one final terrified glance back at me, before Calvin shoves her into the passenger seat and slams the door. He walks around to the driver's side, moving with the heavy, sluggish steps of a man marching to the gallows. He gets into the car and starts the engine. He backs out of my driveway with slow, defeated caution, carefully maneuvering his large luxury SUV around his sobbing daughter, who is still collapsed on the ground. He does not stop to help her up. He does not roll down the window to offer a word of comfort. He simply drives away, leaving Chantel entirely alone on my driveway. I stand there watching the taillights of my father's car disappear around the corner of the gated community. I look down at my sister, who is currently ruining her expensive makeup on my cobblestones, crying out for a husband and a father who both abandoned her the second their money ran out. I do not feel an ounce of pity. I pull my phone out of my pocket, intending to call neighborhood security to have her escorted off the premises, but before I can unlock the screen, it begins to vibrate heavily in my palm. The caller ID flashes with the name of my chief executive assistant, Marcus. I accept the call, lifting the phone to my ear while keeping my eyes locked on Chantel. Dominique, Marcus says, his voice tight with urgent professional energy. I apologize for interrupting your afternoon, but we have a highly sensitive situation developing at the corporate office. I need your immediate authorization on how to proceed. Go ahead, Marcus, I say, my voice perfectly calm, projecting absolute control. What is the situation? We just received an emergency direct line communication from Arthur Vance, Marcus explains. He is Calvin Wilson's primary business partner and the co-founder of the logistics firm. Arthur explicitly bypassed his own legal team and demanded to speak directly to the head of Sterling Acquisitions. I raise an eyebrow, a slow, genuine smile finally spreading across my face. And what exactly does Arthur Vance want? Marcus pauses for a fraction of a second, the weight of the corporate betrayal hanging heavy over the phone line. He is begging for a secret side deal, Dominique. Arthur knows Calvin has been compromised by his son-in-law's massive embezzlement. He wants to execute a hostile internal maneuver to push your father out of the company entirely before the acquisition tomorrow morning. Arthur is offering to hand you total control of the logistics firm today, but only if you agree to let him completely destroy Calvin first. The Sterling Acquisitions corporate headquarters occupies the top 3 floors of the tallest glass high-rise in the financial district. The building is a towering monolith of steel and tinted windows, designed specifically to intimidate anyone standing on the sidewalk below. Calvin steps off the private executive elevator at exactly 2 minutes to 9 o'clock. He is wearing his best bespoke charcoal suit, holding a monogrammed leather briefcase with white-knuckled tension. He is sweating lightly at the temples, but he is desperately trying to project an aura of absolute power. He expects a room full of aging white men in expensive suits. He expects warm handshakes, fine cigars, and backslapping camaraderie. He fully expects them to treat him like an industry titan, retiring with the highest honors. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly neutral expression, does not offer him coffee or engaging small talk. She simply checks his name against her digital registry, stands up, and guides him down the long corridor of frosted glass. Her heels click rhythmically against the polished marble floor. She stops at the end of the hall and pulls open the heavy double doors to the primary boardroom, gesturing for him to step inside before silently pulling the doors shut behind him. The heavy locking mechanism engages with a definitive metallic click, sealing him inside. The boardroom is cavernous and aggressively modern. Floor-to-ceiling windows offer a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. A pristine mahogany conference table stretches for 20 feet down the center of the space. There is no team of faceless corporate executives waiting to shower him with praise. There is no spread of catered pastries or hot coffee. There is only me. I am sitting alone at the head of the table, wearing a sharply tailored white blazer, my hands folded neatly over a stack of legal documents. Calvin steps over the threshold and freezes. He blinks rapidly, his mind completely short-circuiting as he tries to process the visual information in front of him. He actually shakes his head, as if trying to physically dislodge the image of his estranged daughter sitting in the seat of power. He attempts a condescending chuckle, attempting to quickly regain his footing and reassert his patriarchal dominance. He asks what on earth I am doing here. He tells me this is a highly classified closed corporate meeting and asks if the executives hired my agency to consult on their public relations. He actually has the unmitigated audacity to ask me if I am here to serve as a secretary for the acquisition team. I do not smile. I do not laugh. I raise my hand and gesture to the single solitary leather chair positioned at the exact opposite end of the mahogany table, 20 feet away from my seat. I tell him to sit down, because we have a tremendous amount of ground to cover and I absolutely loathe repeating myself. Calvin reluctantly takes the seat, his posture stiff with indignation and misplaced pride. He places his monogrammed briefcase on the table and demands to know where the actual Sterling Acquisitions executive team is. I tap the smooth glass screen of my tablet. The massive digital display mounted on the wall behind me flickers to life, illuminating the dark room with the grim mathematical reality of his corporate portfolio. I state clearly that I am the entire executive team. I am the sole decision maker, the primary shareholder, the architect of this buyout, and the executioner of his failing legacy. I pull up the first slide. I do not raise my voice. I speak with the cold mechanical precision of a surgeon dissecting a corpse. I walk him through the catastrophic financial hemorrhage caused entirely by his blind, unwavering faith in Trent. I point to the massive, glaring deficits in his operating capital. I detail the vendor invoices that have gone completely unpaid for over 90 days, causing severe supply chain disruptions. I highlight the predatory off-the-books bridge loans. Trent secretly secured using Calvin's forged signature loans that are currently accruing compound interest at a ruinous daily rate. I pull up the commercial real estate reports, showing that his primary warehouse leases are actively in default. I explain that his logistics firm is not just struggling to compete in the current market, but is in a state of terminal cardiac arrest. It is a hollow, rotting shell propped up by toxic debt and highly illegal fraudulent accounting practices orchestrated by his golden son-in-law. Calvin is gripping the armrests of his ergonomic chair so hard his knuckles are completely white. He tries to interrupt to bluster his way through the facts to claim that these are just temporary market fluctuations that can be easily managed with a minor injection of capital. I cut him off sharply. I tell him that denial is a luxury reserved for men who actually have money in the bank. I pick up the thick stack of legal documents resting in front of me and slide them forcefully down the length of the polished mahogany table. The heavy packet glides with a smooth, menacing hiss, stopping exactly inches from his trembling fingertips. I tell him to open it. I announce that this is the revised acquisition contract. The original offer, the one that included a multi-million-dollar cash payout, a generous stock option, and a permanent highly compensated seat on the corporate advisory board, has been completely incinerated. I inform him that I am buying his company for pennies on the dollar. He will receive absolutely no golden parachute. He will not retain a single fractional share of company stock. He will surrender all intellectual property, all physical fleet assets, and all confidential client lists immediately. He will vacate his corner office by noon today, leaving his company keys and his corporate credit cards on his desk. His name will be permanently scrubbed from the corporate letterhead before the close of business. I look him dead in the eye and explain the brutal reality of his position. He is walking away from this table with exactly enough capital to pay off the aggressive shadow creditors Trent invited into his life. He is walking away with just enough money to keep himself and his son-in-law out of a federal penitentiary. He gets nothing more. Calvin stares at the revised contract as if it is a venomous snake preparing to strike. His face flushes a deep, dangerous purple, and the veins in his neck bulge visibly against his starched collar. He slams his heavy hand down on the table, sending a loud shockwave echoing through the silent boardroom. He screams that I have completely lost my mind. He roars that he built this logistics company from the ground up with his bare hands before I was even born. He calls me an ungrateful, vindictive child trying to play a ruthless man's game. He stands up, shoving his heavy leather chair backwards so violently it tips over and crashes onto the carpeted floor. He points a shaking, furious finger at my face and declares that he will never sign this insulting piece of garbage. He threatens to walk right out of this building and call his biggest regional competitor. He brags that he will sell his entire business to them by the end of the day, just to ensure I never get my hands on his legacy. He tells me I have severely overplayed my hand and that I am about to learn a very painful permanent lesson in corporate loyalty and business strategy. He turns his back on me, marching toward the heavy double boardroom doors with desperate manufactured bravado. He reaches out to grasp the thick brass handle, completely convinced he still holds the power to control his own destiny. I do not move from my seat. I do not raise my voice to stop him. I simply reach under the edge of the mahogany table and press the small silver button discreetly mounted on my hidden intercom console. A second later, the secondary door on the far side of the boardroom swings open. Calvin stops dead in his tracks, his hand hovering over the brass handle. He turns his head slowly, his face twisting in sudden confusion to see who is entering my private domain. Arthur Vance steps into the room. Arthur is Calvin's oldest friend, his most trusted confidant, and the co-founder who legally owns the remaining 49% of the logistics firm. Arthur is wearing a rumpled gray suit and carrying his own personal copy of the revised acquisition contract, along with a silver luxury pen. He looks exhausted and completely devoid of sentimentality. He does not look at Calvin. He looks directly at me, sitting at the head of the table, and gives me a slow, respectful nod of complete submission. Arthur Vance steps fully into the cavernous boardroom, letting the heavy mahogany door swing shut behind him with a resonant thud that seals Calvin inside. The brass handle slips completely from Calvin's sweaty palm. He stands frozen, staring at his oldest friend and business partner with an expression of profound betrayal and utter bewilderment. Arthur does not offer a warm greeting. He does not reach out for a handshake. He deliberately straightens his rumpled gray suit jacket and walks right past Calvin, completely ignoring the sputtered questions falling from Calvin's lips. Arthur moves methodically down the length of the long table and takes the leather chair directly to my right, aligning himself perfectly with my position of power. Calvin stumbles backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes catching slightly on the thick carpet. He points a trembling finger at Arthur, his face contorted in absolute outrage. He demands to know what Arthur is doing in this building. He accuses Arthur of corporate treason, of going behind his back to conspire with the enemy. He raises his voice, attempting to summon the booming patriarchal authority that used to make his employees cower in fear. But the sound merely echoes weakly off the floor to ceiling glass windows. He tells Arthur that they built their logistics empire together, and demands that Arthur stand up and leave this insulting trap immediately. Arthur opens his leather portfolio and looks at Calvin with a mixture of deep exhaustion and profound disgust. Arthur tells Calvin that he is a complete fool who allowed his own ego to destroy a 30-year legacy. He explains in a cold, clinical tone that he recognized the catastrophic financial hemorrhage months ago. Arthur says he saw the gaping holes in the quarterly reports and knew that Trent was bleeding their operational capital dry to fund his fraudulent tech startup. Arthur states that he came to Calvin with the evidence, begging him to audit his golden son-in-law, but Calvin refused to listen. Calvin was so blindly obsessed with Trent's superficial country club charm and so desperate to maintain the illusion of his perfect wealthy family that he threatened to fire Arthur for questioning Trent's integrity. Arthur leans forward, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany table. He tells Calvin that he refused to let his own livelihood sink to the bottom of the ocean just because Calvin wanted to play pretend. Arthur turns his head and looks directly at me, acknowledging my absolute authority in the room, before turning his gaze back to his former partner. Arthur explains that when he realized Calvin was going to let Trent bankrupt them both, he actively sought out a corporate lifeline. He reached out to Sterling Acquisitions. Calvin shakes his head violently, a low sound of denial tearing from his throat. He takes a step toward the table, his chest heaving. He tells Arthur that he cannot make unilateral deals with an outside buyer. Calvin puffs out his chest, trying to reclaim his shattered dominance, and loudly declares that he still owns 51% of the voting shares. He states that he is the majority shareholder, the undisputed chief executive officer, and he explicitly forbids Arthur from negotiating with me. I do not raise my voice. I simply tap the screen of my tablet, pulling up the final unassailable piece of my corporate trap. I project the digital contract onto the massive screen behind me. I tell Calvin that his math is severely outdated. I explain that Arthur did not negotiate a future buyout. Arthur executed an immediate total transfer of assets at 6 o'clock this morning. Arthur legally signed his entire 49% stake in the logistics firm directly over to Sterling Acquisitions. But I did not stop there. I remind Calvin of the predatory off-the-books bridge loans that Trent secured, using Calvin's own personal equity as collateral. I inform my father that my corporate legal team quietly purchased that shadow debt 3 weeks ago. When Trent missed the midnight payment deadline last night, those shares defaulted directly to the debt holder. They defaulted to me. I look at Calvin, watching the devastating reality crush the air right out of his lungs. I hold his gaze and deliver the final fatal blow. I tell him that combining Arthur's transferred shares with the defaulted equity I seized from Trent, I now officially own 82% of his company. He no longer has the majority vote. He no longer has leverage. He has absolutely nothing. The physical reaction is instantaneous. Calvin's knees completely buckle beneath him. The titan of industry, the untouchable patriarch who ruled our family with an iron fist, practically collapses into the nearest chair. He slumps forward, his broad shoulders shaking, his face buried in his hands. The sheer magnitude of his humiliation is absolute. He has been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and completely eradicated by the very daughter he spent his entire life degrading. I stand up from my seat at the head of the table, smoothing down the lapels of my crisp white blazer. The room is dead silent save for the ragged sound of Calvin's breathing. I formally convene an emergency meeting of the new board of directors consisting entirely of myself and Arthur Vance. I call for an immediate vote to restructure the executive leadership of the firm. Arthur raises his hand in favor. I raise my hand to join him. I declare the vote unanimous. I look down at the broken man slumping in his chair, and I spell out his new reality with surgical precision. I inform Calvin that he is immediately and permanently stripped of his title as Chief Executive Officer. His corner office is gone. His corporate expense accounts are frozen. His private parking space has been revoked. I tell him that he is officially nothing more than a low-level contracted employee of Sterling Acquisitions. He answers to the board. He answers to Arthur. But most importantly, he answers to me. The daughter he called a failure. The daughter he claimed was socially unfit and completely incapable of understanding real business. He is my subordinate, and his entire financial survival depends entirely on my mercy. Calvin completely shatters. The final shred of his arrogant facade dissolves, leaving behind a weeping, pathetic shell of a man. Tears spill from his eyes, tracking down his weathered cheeks and dripping onto his expensive silk tie. He reaches across the wide expanse of the mahogany table, his hands shaking violently as he desperately tries to grasp at the edges of my blazer. He begs me to stop. He begs me to remember that we are flesh and blood. His voice drops into a high-pitched, pathetic whine, completely stripping himself of all dignity. He tries to invoke the sacred bond of family, desperate to find an emotional trigger that will save him from the corporate slaughterhouse. Dominique, please, he sobs, his chest heaving with exertion. I am your father. You are my little girl. Please do not do this to me. When I do not immediately respond, he frantically searches his memory for a lifeline. He pulls out a story from decades ago, trying to weaponize my childhood nostalgia. He cries and tells me to remember the summer I was 7 years old. He paints a desperate picture of the afternoon in the park when he taught me how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. He tells me how he held onto the back of the small pink seat, running alongside me on the grass, promising he would never let me fall. He swears through his tears that he has always loved me deep down and begs me to look at him as the father who held my hand, not the man who made a few terrible business mistakes. He pleads for grace. I look down at his reaching, trembling hands, and I feel absolutely nothing. There is no warmth in my chest, no sudden surge of daughterly affection, no urge to forgive. The man crying in front of me is a stranger who only decided to love me when I bought the deed to his life. I take a deliberate step back, moving completely out of his reach. I shatter his emotional manipulation with icy, ruthless efficiency. I tell Calvin that I remember my childhood perfectly, but the memory that defines our relationship is not a bicycle in the park. I tell him to remember the day I graduated summa cum laude from university. I describe standing on the sweltering campus lawn in my black cap and gown, scanning the crowded bleachers for hours looking for my parents. I remind him that I stood completely alone on the most important day of my academic life, because he chose to fly to Florida to watch Trent play in a meaningless amateur golf tournament. Trent was merely a boyfriend at the time, and yet Calvin still chose him over his own daughter's college graduation. Calvin opens his mouth to offer a pathetic excuse, but I cut him off. I remind him of the phone call he made to me from the golf course clubhouse later that afternoon. I remind him that when I cried and asked why he abandoned me, he scoffed and told me to stop being emotional. I lean forward, placing my hands flat on the mahogany table until my face is mere inches from his tear-stained cheeks. I repeat the exact words he used to justify his absence that day. I tell him that life is about strategic alliances, not sentimental obligations. I offer him a cold, dead smile and whisper his own mantra right back into his face. Business is business. Calvin buries his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail of total defeat. He knows there is no escape. The trap is completely sealed, and he built the cage himself. Before he can formulate another desperate plea, the sharp buzzing of the red light on my desktop intercom cuts through the heavy atmosphere of the boardroom. I straighten my posture and press the silver button. Marcus's voice fills the room, tightly controlled, but vibrating with unmistakable urgency. Dominique, building security, is requesting immediate instruction on the ground floor. I narrow my eyes, keeping my gaze locked on Calvin's sobbing form. What is the issue, Marcus? It is your sister, Marcus replies, the tension crackling over the speaker. Chantel just bypassed the front desk and breached the primary lobby. She is completely unhinged, Dominique. She is screaming at the reception staff, throwing stanchions across the floor and demanding to see you immediately. She is refusing to leave until she gets access to the boardroom. I look at the intercom console, then at Calvin, whose sobbing has reduced to pathetic wet gasps. Arthur Vance sits silently to my right, a cold spectator to the absolute destruction of the Wilson family myth. Send her up, Marcus. I instruct, my tone eerily placid. Escort her directly to the boardroom. I release the intercom button and steep my fingers together. I watch the heavy mahogany doors, listening to the muffled chaos approaching down the quiet executive corridor. The doors violently swing open, slamming against the magnetic wall stops with a deafening crack. Chantel stumbles into the room. The pristine country club illusion she has aggressively cultivated her entire life is utterly obliterated. Her expensive designer silk dress is deeply wrinkled and stained with mud from where she collapsed on my cobblestone driveway. Dark, heavy streaks of waterproof mascara run down her cheeks, in jagged rivers pooling in the crevices of her panicked face. She is breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically around the cavernous room until they lock onto my position at the head of the table. She doesn't even register Arthur sitting quietly nearby. She barely registers our father, who is slumped over the table, a defeated, broken shell of a man. "I took everything!" Chantel screams, her voice cracking, the sound echoing shrilly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. She marches toward the conference table, her hands shaking so violently that her diamond tennis bracelet rattles audibly against her wrist. "Trent, he took it all, Dominique. I remain perfectly still in my ergonomic chair, projecting an aura of absolute composure against her manic hysteria. I do not offer her a seat. I do not offer her a glass of water. I simply watch her unravel. I went to the bank immediately after he sped off. She sobs, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach, as if physically trying to hold her shattered reality together. I tried to transfer the funds from our joint accounts to my private checking. The branch manager looked at me like I was insane. The accounts are completely empty, all of them. The joint savings, the high-yield investment portfolios, the emergency liquid funds, they hold a zero balance. She lets out a guttural, pathetic wail, leaning heavily against the polished wood of the table. Trent had been preparing for this exact moment. The second he realized I had quietly purchased his shadow debt and that Calvin's logistics firm was going under. Trent knew the federal authorities would be looking directly at his fraudulent tech startup. He knew the massive embezzlement charges were imminent, and he was not going down with a sinking ship. He left me a 40-second voicemail from an untraceable burner phone. Chantel hyperventilates, her knuckles turning white as she grips the table to keep her knees from giving out. He is already on a private charter out of the country. He wired every single cent of our money to an offshore account in the Caymans. He told me I am on my own. He left me to face the federal investigators alone, Dominique. I am completely penniless. The mortgage on the estate is 3 months past due. The platinum credit cards are completely maxed out. He even forged my signature on a secondary business loan. I have absolutely nothing. Calvin slowly raises his head from his hands, staring at his golden daughter in absolute horror. The perfect wealthy life. He funded the flawless marriage he bragged about at his exclusive country club dinners was nothing but a hollow, toxic lie. He opens his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of patriarchal comfort to his favorite child, but no words come out. He has no money left to save her. He is a subordinate employee in my corporation, stripped of his power, his title, and his dignity. Chantel ignores him entirely. Her survival instincts kick in, and she redirects all her desperate, frantic energy toward the only person in the room who holds any actual leverage. Me. She rounds the table, rushing toward my chair. She falls heavily to her knees, her stained silk dress pooling around her on the thick carpet. She reaches out, attempting to grab my hands, but I smoothly pull them back, resting them flat on the leather armrests of my chair. Dominique, please. Chantel begs, tears dripping from her chin onto the floor. You have to help me. We are sisters. We are blood. I know we have had our differences in the past, but I am family. You cannot let me drown like this. She looks up at me with wide, pleading eyes, trying to leverage a sacred sisterhood that never existed. I just need a loan. She babbles, the words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. Just enough cash to hire a decent federal defense attorney before the authorities raid the house. And I need a place to stay. The bank is going to formally foreclose on the estate by the end of the week. Please, Dominique, let me move into your guest house. It is huge. You barely even use it. I will stay completely out of your way. I just need a safe place to figure things out. I look down at the weeping woman kneeling on my boardroom floor. For 32 years, Chantel was the untouchable princess of the Wilson family. She was the one who received the brand new luxury cars, the fully funded Ivy League tuition, the lavish six-figure wedding. She was the one who stood by and smirked while our mother relentlessly criticized my weight, my career choices, and my fierce independence. I slowly stand up, towering over her. The air in the boardroom turns instantly freezing. Sisterhood. I say the word, tasting like toxic ash in my mouth. You want to invoke sisterhood now that your fraudulent husband has robbed you blind and left you for dead. Chantel nods frantically, desperate tears streaming down her face. Yes, yes, please, Dominique. We are family. Stand up. I command, my voice slicing through the room with the force of a steel whip. She scrambles to her feet, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, a glimmer of hopeful relief sparking in her red-rimmed eyes. She actually thinks her pathetic display of submission has worked. I step closer to her, closing the distance until she is forced to look directly into my cold, unwavering gaze. You laughed. I state, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that makes Arthur Vance physically flinch in his seat. You stood in my parents' formal dining room 3 years ago. You held a crystal glass of expensive champagne in your perfectly manicured hand, And you laughed when Mom slapped my daughter across the face and called her ugly. Chantel's face drains of all remaining color. The memory hits her with the devastating force of a freight train. My daughter was 5 years old. I continue, my tone absolute and entirely unforgiving. She accidentally knocked over a cheap vase. Mom struck her hard enough to leave a red stinging welt on her cheek. Mom told my child she was a clumsy, ugly, unwanted mistake. And you, Chantel, you took a sip of your champagne and you laughed. You told my crying 5-year-old child to stop being so dramatic. Chantel takes a stumbling step backward, shaking her head in a frantic motion of denial. Dominique, I didn't mean, it was a joke. You do not get to invoke sisterhood. I declare, shutting down her weak protest instantly. You do not get to seek shelter in the house you actively tried to burn down. You will never set foot on my property. You will never come anywhere near my daughter. You will not get a single cent of my personal money to clean up the toxic criminal mess you and your husband created. Chantel begins to openly sob again, a harsh grating sound of total defeat. Calvin covers his face once more, unable to watch the absolute destruction of his golden child. He has failed her just as he failed me, but this time the consequences are terminal. I walk back to my chair and pick up a thin manila folder from the polished mahogany table. However, I say smoothly, my voice instantly cutting through her wailing. I am a businesswoman, and Sterling Acquisitions currently has an open position that urgently needs to be filled. Chantel stops crying abruptly, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist. The sheer ingrained arrogance bred into her DNA flares up even in her absolute lowest moment. She practically vibrates with sudden desperate hope. She thinks I am offering her a corporate lifeline, a high-paying executive role to save her from financial ruin and maintain her country club status. I am willing to offer you a strict employment contract, I state, extending the folder toward her. Your salary will be aggressively garnished weekly to pay off the monumental legal fees you are about to incur. It includes basic entry-level health benefits and a severely strict attendance policy. If you are late, you are terminated. Chantel steps forward and snatches the folder from my hand. A smug, deeply relieved smile begins to twitch at the corners of her mouth. She expects a vice president title. She expects a corner office with a view of the skyline. She expects to be handed a six-figure salary simply because she shares my last name. She flips the folder open, her eyes darting eagerly to the bold text at the top of the employment contract. I watch the exact second her arrogant smile dies. I watch the color drain from her face completely. I watch her eyes widen in absolute unadulterated horror as she reads her new official job title within my corporation. Chantel's eyes track back and forth across the crisp white paper, her perfectly manicured fingernail tracing the bold black ink at the top of the page. The silence in the cavernous boardroom is so profound that the faint rustle of the document trembling in her hands sounds like a localized earthquake. She reads the job title once, blinks rapidly, in a desperate attempt to clear her vision, and reads it again, as if the words might magically rearrange themselves into the vice president of marketing role she fully expected. Her mouth drops open, her jaw practically unhinging, as the horrific reality of the document finally penetrates her deeply ingrained entitlement. She looks up at me, her highlighted hair falling in disarray around her pale, tear-streaked face. She demands to know if this is some sort of sick, twisted joke. I maintain my absolute composure, my hands still resting flat on the leather armrests of my executive chair. I assure her in a voice as smooth and cold as polished glass that Sterling Acquisitions does not squander corporate resources printing joke contracts. I detail the exact parameters of the position outlined on the paper she is holding. She will report directly to the head of building maintenance at exactly 10 o'clock every single night. Her duties will include emptying the wastebaskets in the junior accounting bullpen, sanitizing the employee break room refrigerators, and deep cleaning the executive washrooms on floors 4 through 10. She will be required to wear the standard gray polyblend uniform issued by Human Resources. Her compensation will be exactly minimum wage, and as per the addendum attached to the second page, 70% of her weekly net pay will be automatically garnished and routed to a dedicated escrow account. This account will solely cover the exorbitant federal defense attorneys she will desperately need when the Securities and Exchange Commission finishes mapping Trent's illegal offshore wire transfers. Chantel drops the manila folder onto the mahogany table as if the paper itself has physically burned her flesh. She takes a staggering step backward, her chest heaving with violent, indignant breaths. She screams that she has a master's degree in communications from a top-tier university. She shrieks that she has never held a mop in her entire life, and she certainly will not start now by cleaning the toilets of my corporate employees. She demands to know how I could be so incredibly vindictive, so entirely devoid of basic human compassion to offer my own flesh and blood a menial janitorial position while I sit in a billion-dollar glass tower. I stand up, fully resting my knuckles on the table and leaning toward her, closing the physical distance between us. I tell her that I am offering her the exact same opportunity she and our parents offered me when I was starting my agency in a cramped apartment. Absolutely nothing. I remind her that honest, grueling manual labor builds character, something she severely lacks. I state clearly that this contract is the single solitary handout she will ever receive from me for the rest of her natural life. She has a definitive choice. She can sign the dotted line put on the gray polyblend uniform and start working off her monumental debts, or she can walk out of this building and wait for the federal marshals to seize her estate while she has exactly $0 in her checking account. Chantel lets out an ear-piercing scream of pure, unadulterated frustration, realizing that her lifelong privilege has completely evaporated. She snatches the heavy silver luxury pen off the table and hurls it directly at my face with all her remaining strength. I do not even flinch as the metal projectile sails past my ear and clatters harmlessly against the reinforced glass window behind me. She spins around and storms out of the boardroom, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the expensive carpet, her hysterical sobs echoing down the executive corridor until the heavy doors slam shut behind her. The silence that settles over the room in the wake of Chantel's explosive exit is heavy, oppressive, and absolute. I slowly shift my gaze back down the length of the long mahogany table. Calvin is still slumped in his chair, looking thoroughly destroyed. The vibrant, arrogant titan of the logistics industry has completely vanished, replaced by an exhausted, aging man who has just watched his entire familial and corporate legacy evaporate in the span of 30 minutes. Arthur Vance, who has remained perfectly silent and motionless throughout the entire ordeal, reaches into his jacket pocket and produces his own silver pen. He slides the revised buyout contract across the short distance, separating him from his former business partner. He taps the signature line at the bottom of the final page with a rigid finger. Arthur tells Calvin in a low, gravelly voice, entirely stripped of sentimentality, that the show is permanently over, and it is time to sign the paperwork. Calvin stares at the dotted line. His chest rises and falls in shallow, defeated increments. He looks at me one last time, searching my face for any microscopic fraction of daughterly hesitation, any sign that I might suddenly yield to the patriarchal authority he wielded over me for 3 decades. He finds absolutely nothing but cold corporate steel. His hands are shaking so badly that he struggles to grip the barrel of the pen. He presses the nib to the paper and signs his name, his signature jagged, weak, and fractured, a far cry from the bold, sweeping strokes he previously used to authorize multi-million-dollar deals. The second the pen lifts from the paper, the logistics empire he spent his entire adult life building is officially dead. It is legally absorbed into the Sterling Acquisitions portfolio, immediately stripped of its original name, and fully integrated into my holding company. I instruct Arthur to coordinate with my legal team to finalize the asset transfers before the end of the business day. Then I press the intercom button and summon building security to the top floor. I look directly at my father and tell him his executive access badge has been permanently deactivated. 2 broad-shouldered security guards enter the boardroom and silently escort Calvin out of the building, completely stripping him of his dignity as he walks past the receptionist's desk for the final time, carrying nothing but his briefcase. Less than 48 hours later, the meticulously crafted social facade of the Wilson family shatters into a million jagged pieces on a highly public stage. It does not start in the respected financial journals or the quiet whispers of the boardroom. It starts in the ruthless local tabloids and digital gossip columns. A highly placed source, likely an ambitious paralegal at one of the federal agencies, or a disgruntled former employee who suffered under Calvin's reign, leaks the entire explosive story to the press. The headlines are absolutely brutal and inescapable. Golden Boy embezzles millions in tech fraud scheme. High society husband flees country, leaves penniless wife to face feds. Logistics titan. Calvin Wilson loses entire empire in hostile takeover. The digital articles detail the exact nature of Trent's offshore wire transfers, the impending bank foreclosure on Chantel's luxury estate, and the shocking revelation that Calvin's mystery corporate buyer was the estranged daughter he had publicly disowned years ago. The social fallout is instantaneous and completely devastating for my parents. Brenda and Calvin's prestigious country club membership is quietly but firmly revoked by the board of directors, citing a strict morality clause in the bylaws regarding federal criminal investigations. The elite charity galas Brenda used to fiercely chair suddenly drop her from their invitation lists without a word of explanation. Their affluent friends and weekly golf partners stop answering their phone calls, treating the Wilson name like a highly contagious financial disease. The empire of appearances they valued above their own child's well-being is reduced to a public laughingstock overnight. They are utterly isolated, trapped in a sprawling suburban home that is rapidly depreciating in value, entirely cut off from the high society that previously defined their existence. I am sitting in my newly expanded corner office, sipping a cup of black coffee and reviewing the preliminary integration reports for the newly acquired logistics assets. My desk is immaculate. My corporate strategies are executing flawlessly, and the market response to the acquisition has driven my stock prices up by 4%. Suddenly, the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my office chimes with a breaking news alert. I glance up from my tablet expecting a standard market update regarding the logistics sector, but my hand freezes halfway to my mouth. The local news channel is broadcasting an exclusive live sit-down interview. Brenda is sitting in a brightly lit television studio, wearing a modest, unassuming pastel cardigan rather than her usual aggressive designer armor. She is dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her face artfully arranged into a mask of profound maternal suffering. The news anchor leans forward, his expression grave, asking her to comment on the hostile corporate takeover that has left her family in absolute ruins. Brenda looks directly into the camera lens, her eyes swimming with perfectly manufactured tears. She claims that she and her husband are innocent victims of a calculated, vicious attack. She publicly accuses me, using my full name on live television, of orchestrating a malicious smear campaign, of stealing her husband's company through illegal manipulation, and of committing blatant, unforgivable elder abuse against her and Calvin. I watch the local news broadcast on the massive high-resolution monitor mounted on the far wall of my corporate office. Brenda is putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. She is sitting in a brightly lit television studio, wearing a modest, unassuming pastel cardigan that is a stark departure from her usual aggressive designer wardrobe. She clutches a damp tissue in her perfectly manicured hands, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with practiced precision to ensure her expensive mascara remains entirely intact. The interviewer, a sympathetic local anchor known for sensationalist human interest pieces, leans forward with a look of profound manufactured empathy. Brenda weaves a masterful fabricated tale of a loving, generous family, torn apart by unbridled corporate greed. She looks directly into the camera lens and claims that she and Calvin gave me everything. She tells the viewing audience that they sacrificed their own financial comfort to fund my early ambitions, only for me to turn around and ruthlessly steal my father's logistics empire the second I gained a shred of power. She paints me as a cold, calculating monster corrupted by wealth. But she does not stop there. She knows exactly how to manipulate the public heartstrings. Her voice begins to tremble with artificial sorrow as she delivers her final devastating blow. She covers her face and weeps that I am keeping her away from her beloved granddaughter. She pleads with the public, claiming her heart is completely shattered because I have maliciously severed all contact between a devoted grandmother and an innocent child. The public reaction is instantaneous and incredibly vicious. The local news segment goes viral within a matter of hours, ripped from the broadcast, and reposted across every major social media platform. My corporate communications team watches in absolute horror as the narrative rapidly spins completely out of control. The court of public opinion is swift and entirely unforgiving. Wealthy socialites in my parents' bougie country club circles immediately rally behind Brenda, sharing the interview with captions calling me a heartless, ungrateful daughter. Business tabloids publish aggressive op-eds questioning my corporate ethics and painting me as a predatory CEO who destroyed her own elderly parents for a slight bump in quarterly profit margins. My personal and professional social media accounts are aggressively flooded with thousands of angry comments from outraged strangers. They accuse me of elder abuse. They demand I step down from my own company. They flood my inbox with messages ordering me to allow my heartbroken mother to see her grandchild. The hashtag boycott Sterling begins to trend locally. Marcus stands in front of my desk, clutching his tablet with a rapidly rising heart rate. He strongly advises me to issue a carefully crafted public relations statement. He wants to draft a sympathetic press release emphasizing family privacy and corporate boundaries to mitigate the catastrophic damage to the Sterling Acquisitions brand. He tells me that corporate sponsors are getting jittery and that we need to immediately control the narrative before the board of directors calls an emergency meeting. I look at Marcus and shake my head. I tell him I will not issue a single word of apology or explanation. I do not play defense. I do not negotiate with terrorists. And I certainly do not let the woman who traumatized my child dictate my public image. I turn my heavy leather executive chair toward my primary workstation and open a highly encrypted folder on my private server. When I built my estate, I installed state-of-the-art high-definition security cameras in every single common area of the property. The system utilizes military-grade audio receptors and captures ultra-clear 4K resolution video. I locate the specific file labeled Thanksgiving and drag it onto my pristine desktop. I do not hire a video editor to splice the footage. I do not add a dramatic musical score or a lengthy explanatory caption defending my character. I simply log directly into my primary social media platform, where my successful media agency has garnered an audience of over 4 million active followers. I attach the raw, unedited video file. I type a single solitary sentence. The truth does not require a public relations strategy. I press the publish button and I lock my screen. The video hits the internet like a seismic shockwave. Millions of people who had just spent the last 24 hours actively vilifying me suddenly find themselves watching a crystal clear, unobstructed view of my formal dining room. The audio is impeccably crisp, capturing the ambient clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the low hum of family conversation. The entire world watches as my tiny, innocent 5-year-old daughter accidentally brushes against a side table, causing a cheap decorative vase to tip over and shatter on the hardwood floor. The world watches as Brenda lunges forward, her face instantly contorting into a terrifying mask of absolute demonic rage. The high-end microphones pick up the sharp, sickening crack of flesh against flesh as my mother violently slaps my child across the face. But the physical violence is not the catalyst that breaks the internet. It is the audio. The microphones capture Brenda's exact words with flawless, horrifying clarity. The world hears this wealthy, supposedly devoted grandmother look down at a crying child and viciously call her an ugly black girl. Chantel's laughter can be heard ringing out clearly in the background. The collective internet stops breathing for a fraction of a second before detonating into an absolute firestorm of unbridled rage. The public backlash reverses direction so violently it creates a cultural whiplash. The bougie social circles that had rallied behind Brenda just hours ago instantly evaporate entirely, scrubbing their supportive posts and issuing desperate, frantic apologies to distance themselves from her radioactive racism. The local news station that aired Brenda's initial interview is forced to issue a humiliating public retraction, interrupting their regular broadcast to apologize for providing a platform to an abusive bigot. The hashtag demanding my downfall is rapidly replaced by millions of users demanding federal child abuse charges be brought against Brenda. The consequences for Calvin and Brenda are absolute and immediate. The prestigious country club that defined their entire social existence permanently revokes their membership by the end of the business day, issuing a stern, highly publicized statement condemning racism and violence. Charitable organizations publicly reject their past donations. Neighbors in their affluent subdivision refuse to look at them. They are universally and aggressively canceled, completely exiled from the elite society they valued above their own flesh and blood. They are trapped in their rapidly depreciating suburban home, hiding behind drawn curtains, while news vans and angry protesters idle at the end of their street. Their social annihilation is absolute. The logistics empire is gone. The offshore retirement funds are gone. The country club status is gone. They have been stripped down to nothing but the toxic foundation of their own making. I am standing by the floor-to-ceiling window in my office, watching the afternoon city traffic far below when Marcus knocks tentatively on my door. He steps into the room holding a thick manila envelope that was just delivered by a priority legal courier. He looks deeply unsettled, his professional demeanor cracking slightly under the weight of whatever document he is holding. I turn away from the window and take the heavy envelope from his hands. I slide my finger under the paper flap and pull out a thick stack of formal legal documents stamped by the county family court. Calvin, having lost his company, his fortune, and his entire social standing, has executed one final, desperate, utterly delusional maneuver to force his way back into my life and extract a financial settlement. I read the bold header on the legal petition, and a dark, dangerous calm settles over my features. My father is not suing me for corporate fraud. He is not suing me for breach of contract. Calvin Wilson has officially filed a federal lawsuit against me, suing for grandparents' rights. He is legally demanding court-mandated unsupervised visitation with the exact same granddaughter his wife physically and verbally assaulted. The heavy oak doors of the family court swing shut with a hollow thud, sealing us inside the sterile, windowless room. The atmosphere is clinically cold, entirely devoid of the mahogany and leather warmth of the corporate boardrooms Calvin and Brenda are accustomed to. They sit across the aisle from me at a battered wooden table, looking like pale, deflated replicas of their former selves. Brenda is wearing the same faded pastel cardigan she wore during her disastrous television interview, desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of the weeping, heartbroken grandmother. Calvin sits stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead. They could not afford their usual high-powered corporate legal team. Instead, they are represented by a visibly exhausted family law attorney, who looks as though he deeply regrets taking this case on contingency. The judge, a stern, non-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics, calls the session to order. Calvin's lawyer stands up and immediately launches into a deeply rehearsed, highly manipulative narrative. He paints a tragic picture of loving, devoted grandparents who have been maliciously alienated from their only grandchild. He claims that I am using my vast wealth and corporate power to exact petty familial revenge. He uses buzzwords like parental alienation, emotional distress, and the best interest of the child. He formally requests that the court grant Calvin and Brenda unsupervised weekly visitation with Zuri. The underlying motive is so glaringly obvious, it practically illuminates the courtroom. Unsupervised visitation is not about love, it is about access. It is about getting a permanent legal foot in the door of my life. It is a calculated attempt to use my daughter as a human shield and a financial hostage. If they can secure court-mandated access to Zuri, they can eventually petition for grandparent maintenance or use the threat of continuous, disruptive legal battles to extort a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement from my estate. They view my child as nothing more than a highly lucrative bargaining chip to restore their shattered country club lifestyle. I sit perfectly still beside my attorney. I do not scowl. I do not object. I simply let their lawyer finish building his towering, fragile house of cards. When it is our turn to speak, my attorney does not deliver a passionate, emotional counter-argument. He simply stands, addresses the judge, and requests permission to submit exactly 2 pieces of evidence into the official court record. The judge nods, and the bailiff rolls a large high-definition monitor to the center of the courtroom. My attorney presses play. The courtroom plunges into absolute dead silence as the unedited security footage from Thanksgiving dinner begins to roll on the massive screen. The judge leans forward, adjusting her glasses. She watches the crystal-clear video of my tiny, innocent 5-year-old daughter accidentally bumping into a side table. She watches the cheap vase shatter. She watches Brenda lunge forward, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The high-quality audio receptors catch every single frequency of the interaction. The sharp, violent crack of my mother's hand, striking my daughter's face, echoes off the cinder-block walls of the courtroom, causing the court reporter to physically flinch. Then comes the audio. Brenda's voice dripping with venom, calling my crying child an ugly black girl, followed instantly by Chantel's cruel, mocking laughter in the background. Brenda lets out a strangled gasp and buries her face in her hands, physically shrinking away from the monitor. Calvin stares at the table, his face completely drained of blood. Their lawyer closes his eyes and pinches the bridge of his nose, realizing instantly that his career is now associated with this radioactive display of child abuse. Before the judge can even process the sheer horror of the video, my attorney slides a thick bound folder across the bench. He informs the court that Exhibit B outlines the precise timeline of the plaintiff's sudden desperate interest in their granddaughter. The folder contains the fully audited financial records of Calvin's logistics empire, the offshore wire transfers executed by Trent, the hostile takeover of their corporate assets, and the bank foreclosure documents for their primary residence. My attorney points out the undeniable, unassailable fact that Calvin and Brenda never once sought visitation, never sent a birthday card, and never made a single phone call to Zuri until exactly 48 hours after their net worth hit zero. The evidence proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this lawsuit is not born of familial love. It is a malicious, financially motivated extortion attempt wrapped in a fraudulent claim of grandparents' rights. The judge closes the folder. She removes her glasses and places them deliberately on the wooden bench. The air in the courtroom is so thick with tension it is difficult to breathe. When she speaks, her voice is dangerously quiet, vibrating with an intense professional fury. She addresses Calvin and Brenda directly, her gaze pinning them to their cheap plastic chairs. She states that in her 20 years on the bench, she has rarely witnessed such a sickening, transparent manipulation of the family court system. She tears their character to absolute shreds with surgical precision. She calls their lawsuit a frivolous, malicious, and entirely predatory abuse of the legal process. She looks Brenda directly in the eye and tells her that any individual who strikes a child and weaponizes racist rhetoric forfeits all moral and legal rights to that child's presence forever. The judge picks up her gavel and delivers the final crushing verdict with rapid, definitive strikes. Calvin completely deflates, sliding down in his chair as the last shred of his patriarchal dominance is legally stripped away. Brenda is hyperventilating, clutching her chest as the reality of her permanent exile sinks in, but the judge is not finished. She raises her hand, commanding total silence. She declares that because this lawsuit was filed with clear malicious intent to harass and extort the court, will not allow the victim to shoulder the financial burden. The judge formally orders Calvin and Brenda to pay 100% of my exorbitant corporate legal fees. The total sum is massive. It is the exact amount required to completely wipe out the very last remnants of their personal emergency savings. They are financially flatlined. They have no company, no assets, no home, and now absolutely no cash reserves to survive the coming week. The gavel strikes the sounding block with a final deafening crack, adjourning the court and sealing their absolute ruin. I stand up, smooth the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit, and walk out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. The hallway outside is brightly lit by afternoon sun streaming through tall arched windows. I stand near the elevators, flanked by my security detail, waiting patiently for the doors to open. A moment later, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swing open, and Calvin and Brenda stumble out into the corridor. They look entirely broken, physically aged by decades in the span of a single hour. They are whispering frantically to each other, completely paralyzed by the reality of the crippling legal fees they have just been ordered to pay. They spot me standing by the elevators and freeze. For the first time in my entire life, they do not look at me with disgust, disappointment, or condescending arrogance. They look at me with pure, unadulterated fear. They know I hold the absolute power of life and death over their future, and they know I have entirely run out of mercy. I take slow, deliberate steps toward them, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. They instinctively back up until their shoulders hit the cold stone wall of the corridor. They have absolutely nowhere left to run. I do not raise my voice. I do not gloat. I maintain the cold, terrifying composure of a corporate apex predator. I reach into my leather portfolio and extract one final crisp, white envelope. I step directly into Calvin's personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye, and I press the heavy document flat against his trembling chest. I keep my hand flat against the thick paper, forcing Calvin to hold the envelope against his own chest. His breathing is shallow and rapid. Brenda leans in close, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and desperate anticipation. Given the magnitude of their public destruction, she likely expects a massive countersuit, a demand to seize their remaining personal possessions, or a formal declaration of their total bankruptcy. Instead, Calvin slowly breaks the seal. His trembling fingers pull out a crisp, meticulously drafted legal contract. He reads the bold header, and his deeply lined brow furrows in complete confusion. I take a single deliberate step back and allow the reality of the document to wash over them. I explain the exact parameters of my final offer with cold, clinical detachment. The document they are holding is a combination of an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a highly restrictive, heavily monitored financial trust. I tell them I am fully aware that the judge has just ordered them to liquidate the absolute last of their personal savings to cover my exorbitant corporate legal fees. I know they have no home to return to, no hidden offshore accounts left to drain, and absolutely no social network willing to offer them a guest bedroom. They are hours away from literal homelessness. I watch Brenda gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she fully comprehends the sheer magnitude of their destitution. I inform them that I have authorized a modest monthly stipend to be disbursed from a minor subsidiary of my holding company. I spell out the exact mathematics of this stipend. It is calculated down to the very last cent. It provides exactly enough capital to cover the monthly rent on a basic, unremarkable two-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. It covers standard utilities, basic groceries, and public transportation passes. There is no surplus for country club dues, no budget for designer cardigans, and absolutely zero allocation for luxury vehicles or fine dining. It is a strictly enforced survival budget. The terms of this financial lifeline are absolute and completely non-negotiable. I lock eyes with Brenda, ensuring my words penetrate the thick layer of denial she has hidden behind her entire life. In exchange for this monthly deposit, they must sign away their right to ever speak my name or my daughter's name again. They are legally barred from granting television interviews, publishing memoirs, or posting on any social media platform regarding me, my business, or my child. If they utter a single syllable about Zuri to anyone in public or private, the stipend will be instantly and permanently revoked, leaving them entirely to the mercy of the streets. Calvin stares at the contract, his eyes scanning the unforgiving legal jargon. The silence in the courthouse corridor is heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of Brenda's breathing. For a fleeting second, I see the old Calvin surface, the arrogant patriarch, ready to tear the paper in half and declare his righteous independence. But the fire in his eyes extinguishes just as quickly as it ignited. The crushing reality of his complete financial annihilation anchors his feet to the marble floor. He has no leverage, he has no power. He is a beggar holding a cup out to the daughter he spent decades degrading. Brenda reaches out and touches Calvin's arm. Her manicured fingernails dig into his cheap, wrinkled suit jacket. She looks at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated defeat. She knows they have exhausted every possible avenue of manipulation. The cameras are gone. Their wealthy friends have abandoned them. The judge has stripped them of their final defense. They have absolutely nothing left but the brutal, humiliating grace I am choosing to extend. Calvin reaches into his breast pocket and slowly withdraws a simple plastic pen. He turns toward the cold stone wall of the corridor and presses the document against the smooth surface. His hand shakes violently as he signs his name on the designated line. He then hands the pen to Brenda. She does not look at me. She keeps her eyes glued to the marble floor as she scrawls her signature next to his, effectively erasing herself from the narrative of my life forever. I step forward and smoothly slide the contract out of Calvin's hands. I verify the signatures with a quick, detached glance. I do not offer a parting word of comfort. I do not offer a final insult. Their absolute silence is the only closure I require. I turn my back on the people who gave me life and walk away. The afternoon sun pours through the massive arched windows at the end of the corridor, bathing the hallway in warm golden light. My security detail falls into step behind me. I step into the elevator, press the button for the lobby, and watch the heavy metal doors slide shut, permanently sealing Calvin and Brenda in the past. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh, sterile lighting of the family courthouse feels like a lifetime away. I am standing in the center of a massive, sunlit production studio located on the top floor of a newly acquired commercial building in the Arts District. The walls are painted in vibrant, energizing colors. The polished concrete floors reflect the brilliant afternoon light streaming through expansive skylights. The space hums with the productive, joyous energy of 30 highly paid animators, writers, and sound engineers. This is the crown jewel of the new entertainment subsidiary I launched under the Sterling Acquisitions umbrella. I am wearing a flawlessly tailored emerald green pantsuit, holding a tablet that displays quarterly projections that continue to shatter industry expectations. My corporate empire has expanded exponentially, completely absorbing and restructuring the logistics firm I took from Calvin. But this studio is not about raw profit margins or hostile takeovers. This space is entirely dedicated to creation. I walk past rows of state-of-the-art digital drafting tables, exchanging genuine smiles and collaborative ideas with my creative directors. The atmosphere is built on absolute mutual respect, a stark contrast to the toxic, fear-based regime my father ran for 30 years. I have built a corporate culture where talent is nurtured, not exploited. At the far end of the studio, situated in a brightly lit alcove filled with massive canvases and premium art supplies, is my ultimate triumph. Zuri is sitting on a tall wooden stool, swinging her legs enthusiastically as she paints. She is now 6 years old, and she is absolutely radiant. Her natural hair is styled in beautiful thick puffs that perfectly frame her joyful, expressive face. She is wearing a bright yellow smock covered in vibrant splashes of acrylic paint, completely unbothered by the mess. She lets out a loud, unrestrained laugh as one of the senior animators makes a silly face at her while rendering one of her original character designs on a massive digital monitor. I stand perfectly still and watch her. My chest tightens with a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. Zuri is thriving in a way I was never allowed to as a child. She is completely untouched by the generational trauma, the racist microaggressions, and the suffocating country club toxicity that defined my youth. She does not know what it feels like to shrink herself to make insecure relatives comfortable. She does not know the sting of a grandmother's backhand or the cruel laughter of an entitled aunt. She only knows unconditional love, boundless creative freedom, and the absolute certainty that she is brilliant, beautiful, and deeply valued. I have meticulously eradicated every single threat to her happiness. Tonight is the official season premiere of Zuri's animated series. The show is entirely based on the magical, vibrant characters she began drawing in her sketchbooks when she was just 4 years old. I funded the project, hired the best showrunners in the industry, and transformed her pure, unfiltered imagination into a premium educational broadcast for children worldwide. The studio transforms into a massive celebration as the sun goes down. The catering team sets up a stunning buffet of gourmet food. The room fills with our chosen family. My fiercely loyal executive team, the brilliant animators Marcus, and a diverse, incredibly supportive community of genuine friends and mentors who love Zuri exactly as she is. There are no forced polite conversations, no hidden agendas, and absolutely no performative social climbing. It is a room filled entirely with authentic joy. Zuri spots me across the room and drops her paintbrush. She runs toward me with her arms wide open, her laughter ringing out clear and bright above the music. I drop to one knee and catch her, pulling her into a tight, fierce embrace. She smells like sweet strawberries and fresh paint. She wraps her small arms around my neck and tells me she loves me. I kiss her forehead and tell her I love her more than life itself. I stand up holding my daughter on my hip and look out over the incredible world I have constructed. The painful battles in mahogany boardrooms and cold courthouses feel like ancient history. I did not just survive the gauntlet my family forced me through. I conquered it completely. I look at the bright, secure future stretching out before my daughter, and I know the absolute truth. I did not just protect her peace. I bought the entire kingdom, leveled the rotting foundation, and built a permanent, unbreakable sanctuary in its place. I am living in total victory, completely unbothered and utterly unstoppable. True strength is not found in seeking approval from those who refuse to see your worth, but in the quiet, persistent work of building your own kingdom. When you stop chasing validation and start fueling your own ambition, you reclaim the power that was always yours. Betrayal from those closest to you may be painful, but it is often the catalyst that forces you to outgrow the small boxes they built for you. Remember, you do not need their permission to thrive. You only need the courage to walk away and build something better on your own terms. If you've ever had to build your own success in the face of family doubt, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more tales of resilience and victory.